There's singing and dancing amongst the debris. Children can manage to smile, even amidst the most dire circumstances. But there's little to celebrate this Eid in Gaza. In Rafah, displaced Palestinians performed their prayers next to the rubble of a mosque destroyed in Israel's assault.
This day for me is heartbreaking compared to last Eid. I look at my children and I feel heartbroken. When I sit with them, I start to cry, feeling sad for the days that have passed.
For many in Gaza, the Eid meal will be an aid package. These dropped from the air as international efforts to avert imminent famine continue. Israel says it's allowing more trucks into Gaza than at any time since the start of the war. The UN says their figures aren't accurate and that still not enough aid is permitted to cross the border. Meanwhile, there's been no pause in the bombing. Anna Mabde and her son cradle the bodies of his 3 children killed last night. What are they doing, she cries. Biden, Netanyahu, any Arab country conspiring against Gaza. On Eid, the children should be having fun. This is said to be the moment Hamas's political leader, Ismail Haniyeh, based in Qatar, learns 3 of his sons and several of his grandchildren have been killed in a targeted Israeli strike in Gaza today. Israel described his sons as military operatives. Haniyeh told Al Jazeera it wouldn't change Hamas's negotiating stance. Talks over a ceasefire in exchange for the release of Israeli hostages look to be faltering. Hamas is demanding a total withdrawal of Israeli forces. Israel is still threatening to invade Rafah. At a cemetery in northern Gaza, relatives visit the graves of loved ones to pay their respects on Eid. How many more will die before the guns fall silent?
The Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, has continued his visit to Washington, aiming to hammer home the case for the US Congress to pass a bill containing much-needed financial aid for Ukraine. But in a round of US TV interviews, he pressed Benjamin Netanyahu's government to allow more aid into Gaza after yesterday's announcement that the UK will continue to export weapons to Israel. We're joined now by our Washington correspondent, Siobhan Kennedy. Siobhan.
Well, that's right. David Cameron hit the US airwaves today on a charm offensive, a series of interviews, as he is right now talking to members of Congress. It's all really about 2 things. One is trying to persuade the release of funds to Ukraine that is currently being blocked by Republicans in Congress. But it doesn't look as if that funding is going to be released anytime soon. This being Washington, of course, politics and one Donald Trump is very much getting in the way. The second issue was to stress that Britain still does support Israel. And in the last half an hour or so, Joe Biden has reiterated that he believes that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not doing enough to get humanitarian aid into Gaza. He was critical. That did echo comments from David Cameron earlier on those networks. Let's hear a couple of snippets from what he had to say earlier.
We do think that Israel must prosecute this war according to rules of humanitarian law. And I think that's very important. But of course, we're a country under the rule of law, and we believe all countries should obey the rule of law. And Israel has to think very carefully about how it makes sure aid gets into Gaza. It has a responsibility to those people, and I've been making that very clear.
Well, he sounds very forthright there, but you certainly got the sense, I did yesterday at least, from sources close to David Cameron, that he's a bit queasy about that decision to continue supplying weapons to Israel, not least because the legal advice that his decision was based on happened before the killing of aid workers, including Britain's last week in Gaza, that led to the calls for Britain to stop supplying weapons. So David Cameron knows that those calls will not end anytime soon, and that he will be forced to justify Britain's decision.
Thank you, Siobhan. Siobhan Kennedy in Washington. Now, earlier in his US visit, Lord Cameron resisted pressure to join the likes of Italy, Canada and most recently Turkey in restricting arms exports to Israel. But how much does Britain send? The UK government doesn't send arms directly to Israel, but manufacturers here do. The government granted licenses worth at least $492 million for exports to Israel in the 10 years to 2022. These exports include things like components for fighter jets and software, but it has also granted dozens of what are called open licenses, which don't have a monetary limit. This means the true value of military goods that companies send could be far higher. Now, the UK is not one of the big exporters to Israel. Of all the sales of major arms to Israel over the last 10 years, 5% came from Italy. Our figures are from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Now, here's Germany, supplying nearly a third of these arms imports. And two-thirds, 66%, has come from Israel's closest ally, the United States. Now, Italy has since stopped new sales, but the US continues to give military aid to Israel worth $3.3 billion in the latest year. And since Hamas's attack on October the 7th and the Israeli bombardment of Gaza that followed, two large US arms sales have been made public. Both struck last December. $106 million for tank ammunition and nearly $150 million for artillery shell equipment. But we only know about sales over a certain value. US media reports that more than 100 smaller deals have been agreed, but they're below the reporting threshold. The US State Department told us all arms transfers complied with the procedures set by Congress. So how reliant is Israel on these imports? Well, Israel is a major manufacturer of arms in its own right. And in recent years, it has actually exported arms more than it's imported. 2.1% of global arms imports versus 2.8% of exports. Despite this, analysts say imported weapons have played a major role in Israel's military actions against Hamas. And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said he wants to reduce dependency on military imports. An international court has been asked to look into the issue of arms supply. Nicaragua has brought a case against Germany, accusing the country of aiding genocide through its military exports to Israel. Germany refutes this, saying its exports adhere to international law. And Israel has long said it respects international law and has a right to defend itself against Hamas. The US State Department said it expects Israel will use all US-provided munitions in full compliance with international humanitarian law. And we have a number of ongoing processes to examine that compliance. And the UK stance? Well, yesterday, Lord Cameron said it was consistent with the advice that I and other ministers have received. And as ever, we will keep the position under review.